Hello all, back for another platform fighter video, and today we will be answering the question, is it time for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale 2? Well, the simple answer is yes it is, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, let us go back a bit to the history of the first game for those that may not remember or may not know what the game even is. To set the mood a little, the year was 2011, and while we have many crossover fighters today, they were quite a bit more rare back then. We had Digimon Rumble Arena, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Smash Up, and Cartoon Network Punch-Out! Explosion had just released, but in reality, the market was completely dominated by Super Smash Bros. The games were okay, but people wanted something with a little more quality behind it, and of course PlayStation had been secretly working on their own crossover platform fighter, and it started to leak and seemed to be called Title Fight. Title Fight would use PlayStation characters from Kratos, Parappa, Sweet Tooth, and Fat Princess, and had a couple of stages leaked with it, including a Hades stage from God of War and an Uncharted 2 train stage. The Hades stage moved to the right as Hades followed after you destroying platforms, while the Uncharted stage had you fighting on top of the train and had ships from Warhawk that would destroy the train cars as you were fighting. This was a very early look at the game, and most of this completely changed when it came to the final release, like Hades no longer moving with the stage and it being a little more simple, but now we get to the actual reveal. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale was revealed in April 2012, and over the next few months leading up to the release would have several characters and stages revealed. The game launched to mixed reviews, mostly in part to how different it was to Super Smash Bros. You see, in Super Smash Bros. You could deal damage and chip away at the enemy, and they would get weaker and could be knocked off stage. But in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, it didn't matter how much you hit your opponent because they were not going to go down. You needed to hit your opponents to build up your super meter, which would allow you to use special attacks, and if they hit your opponent, then they would be defeated. While it was extremely unique, it did seem to confuse players or make it feel like you could waste so much time building up your super if you missed. However, on the other end, we got to see a crossover fighter between some extremely iconic characters in gaming, and this had fans delighted, but we never saw a sequel. 2 generations later, and it feels like they completely abandoned the series and have no desire to return. In the past several years, we have seen both Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl and Multiverses get a decent following, but also both seem to not be able to hang on to the player base they built up. They both have super iconic characters, so why aren't they still talked about, or why is Multiverses still not playable? It has to do with the core gameplay or just fan expectation. Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2 was fantastic, but the first game seemed to make people feel the sequel would be much more of the same jank, or they were upset that a lot of the roster and fan favorites were cut in the sequel. On the other end, Multiverses could have been updated forever, but some weird roster choices and core gameplay issues made players quickly abandon it. So why would PlayStation even take a risk in the market if other games don't seem to be able to stack up or last like Super Smash Bros. Does? Well, there are 3 reasons I'm going to argue here. The first reason is quite simple. They can easily learn what went right or wrong with both the first PlayStation All-Stars, but also with other games in the same genre. The second reason is that they are still looking at live service games to be their next big hit, and while it didn't work out for Multiverses, I really think a live service platform fighter does work in theory. Less greed and more polish and you'll have a hit in my opinion. But, the last reason, and something we'll spend quite some time talking about is, well, the characters. Okay, look. Back in 2012 when PlayStation All-Stars released, people were a bit confused on some of the character choices. While BioShock was a huge franchise, having Big Daddy as a playable character had people scratching their heads because he didn't quite have that PlayStation history. They also chose Dante from the reboot of Devil May Cry because the game was coming out, and Raiden from Metal Gear Solid instead of Snake had people screaming at their screens. Fans wanted to see Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, but they were owned by Activision, and fans wanted to see Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, but it didn't seem like Square was interested. So why would this be different this time around? Well, simple. You may not have noticed, but PlayStation has been building up their own portfolio of game series ever since. Let's look at the roster here, because I'm going to say to keep most of it. Cole made complete sense, and having both a good and evil version fits the series so well with the choices you can make in Infamous. Radic, Fat Princess, Jak and Daxter, Kratos, Nathan Drake, Parappa, Ratchet & Clank, Sackboy, Sir Daniel, Sly Cooper, Nariko, Spike, Sweet Tooth, Cat, Emmett, and Toro. These are all still characters people who are PlayStation fans will recognize, and I personally say keep them all. Change their movesets or whatever you need to end up doing, but that is still around 15 characters right away for a roster that just fits. Now this leaves newcomers to the game, and I think this is where it starts to make sense. Since the release of PlayStation All-Stars, PlayStation has introduced us to Delsin and Infamous Second Son, Astrobot as a mascot, Aloy from Horizon, Joel and Ellie, Until Dawn as a series, Jin Sakai and soon Atsu from the Ghost series. Other games like Bloodborne, The Order 1886, Knack, Days Gone, The Last Guardian, Returnal, and of course their Spider-Man games and soon Wolverine if they can manage the rights to that. You could almost double the roster size just from new characters they have introduced over the last 2 generations. But of course they also have series they never introduced characters from in the first game anyways. They still have Wild Arms, Arc the Lad, Siphon Filter, Resistance, Dark Cloud, and others that they could use characters from. That is all franchises that Sony owns and could use for a new crossover fighter. But let's also discuss third party for a second. We talked about the choices before, but what would actually be different this time? Well, let's look at Devil May Cry. Reboot Dante seems to be long gone. Since then, Devil May Cry 5 has released and we are back to older Dante. So I think there would be no issue there, or we could end up with a Resident Evil rep since Capcom is pushing Resident Evil so hard. Metal Gear Solid is coming back with a remake of Snake Eater, so why not throw a big boss into a crossover fighting game? Crash and Spyro are both owned by Microsoft now, and they aren't doing anything with the characters seemingly, and even if they were, they have been releasing their games on PlayStation consoles now, and even let Nintendo use Banjo-Kazooie and Steve for Super Smash Bros. So I don't think it would be impossible to see Crash or Spyro now, like it felt it was back in 2012. Final Fantasy feels linked with PlayStation in ways again, with their games releasing there first and moving to other systems later on. The Final Fantasy VII Remake has had 2 parts released since then too, meaning Cloud could feel extremely likely, and he also appears in Super Smash Bros. The final third-party character I'm going to talk about because people asked for her a lot for the first game is Lara Croft. She is no longer owned by Square and is instead owned by Embracer Group, who seems to actually let other companies use their properties, so I think that could be extremely likely too. This is the main reason why I think releasing a sequel to PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale now just makes sense. The characters and roster limitations feel like they are gone and everything is lining up almost perfectly for a sequel. But what else could actually make it have a big splash? Gameplay wise, we talked about the super bars, and while I think that was fun, I think it should be optional or just an addition to the classical percentage system that is pretty popular in platform fighters. There is no reason to change up something that isn't broken, and I get wanting to be unique, but the percentage system just works. It is just simple to pick up and play and you can understand so quickly what is going on. For stages, I would personally keep the mashups. I think there was something that worked extremely well in the first game and actually felt like the worlds really connected and felt alive. I would keep the arcade story mode they had for the first game, as seeing the characters actually interact or having rivals on their quest to the end of their journey really added a lot and gave each character a reason for being part of the game. Besides that, adding unique minigames and just focusing on the casual pick up and play party scene could make the game have legs. PlayStation feels more popular than ever now, where during the PlayStation 3 generation they had a rough start and an uphill battle to get back to their former glory from the PlayStation 2. They also just had their 30th anniversary, so why not celebrate it in a big way with their characters from across all generations coming together? In the end, a sequel to PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale just feels like it could actually work. PlayStation has extremely iconic characters and are growing their lineup almost every year with new faces. Crossover fighters should be about the fun of having all of these characters come together in a way you don't usually see, and I still see people talk about the first game today, and yes, even ask for a sequel. As I said earlier, everything kinda lines up just right for a new game if they wanted to make one, and I think it could end up being a huge hit if it was just given the time it needed to actually, be a hit. What do you think about PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale? Do you hope to see a sequel? Or do you prefer it just stay in the past? Did you enjoy the first game at all? What characters do you think should make it into a potential sequel? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.